When the subject is Daniel, generally we think of the 7th chapter of Daniel, which is a retelling of the dream that Daniel had about the 4 beasts. Daniel's dream concludes with the return of Christ and the establishment of his government over the kingdoms of this world. The topic today is not the prophecy of Daniel, but a review of the book, a review of Daniel and Christ and government. As background, we'll review the what, why, who, when, and where of Daniel. Turn to the first chapter of Daniel. Under the heading of what, from the first chapter we learn that Daniel and other Jewish youths were subject to the authorities and whims of King Nebuchadnezzar. The where takes place, of course, in Babylon. Why was Daniel a youth? A young person from Judah? Why was he in Babylon? Daniel, along with a portion of the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, had been taken captivity after the fall of Jerusalem. The tribe of Judah fell to foreigners because they had been unfaithful to the God of their fathers. They had learned nothing from the travails of the 10 tribes of Israel, who had been taken into captivity 150 years earlier. The tribe of Judah had ignored the warnings of the prophet Jeremiah. Addressing the question of when, the siege and fall of Jerusalem occurred in the year 597 BC. Daniel was in the first wave of migrants to be carried to Babylon. And consequently, Daniel spent the majority of his life in that city, in that nation. And finally, who was Daniel? Let's read it from the first chapter of Daniel, verses 3, 4, and 5. The king instructed the master of his eunuchs to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men, in whom there was no blemish, handsome, gifted in wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had the ability to serve in the king's palace. Young people, ready to learn the language and literature of the Chaldeans. The king, in verse 5, the king appointed them the daily portion of the king's delicacies and they served 3 years of training, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king of Babylon. Daniel's education was the very best that Babylon had to offer. And with his determination to obey God and to not defile himself, as was written about a little further down in verse 8, Daniel soon rose to an administrative position in the government of Babylon. Now, after the Medes and Persians, by the time the Medes and Persians had conquered the Babylonians, Daniel was no longer a youth. He was a seasoned professional administrator. Darius appointed Daniel as governor over 1/3 of the kingdom. Soon enough, however, slanderers within the Persian government began to murmur against Daniel. So if you would, please turn to chapter 6 of the book of Daniel. Chapter 6 and verse 4. And we're going to stay here in chapter 6, which is a story of how a handful of bureaucrats and holdovers from the previous administration, and Daniel himself was a holdover from the previous administration, how they had maneuvered to indict Governor Daniel for the crime of worshiping his God. But you have to go to verse 3 to see what Daniel's real crime was. And I'll read verse 3 for you of the 6th chapter of the book of Daniel. Governor Daniel had distinguished himself above the 2 other governors and the satraps because he had an excellent spirit in him, and the king was giving thought to setting Governor Daniel over the whole realm. To counteract that possibility, the plotters had snookered King Darius into signing an edict, an executive order, to make prayer to all gods illegal. By the order of the state for the next 30 days, no one shall petition any god or goddess or man, only our King Darius. That means no church service. That means no temple attendance. It's a big change for a lot of people. These colluders didn't really care that much about honoring King Darius. They didn't care about prayer. They didn't care about the rule of law. They didn't care about religion. And they certainly didn't care about the integrity of the vote count. Mostly they wanted Governor Daniel gone by any means necessary. Reading from verse 4, the two other governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find no fault because he was faithful, nor was there any fraud found in him. When reading that passage, I can't help but think about who it was that was indicted on trumped-up charges. I'm thinking about Christ. I'm thinking about Matthew chapter 26, when the chief priest sought to slander our Christ, as is recorded in verse 59 of Matthew 26. The chief priests sought false testimony against Jesus to put him to death. Even though many false witnesses came forward, they found no fault. Then one man came forward to say that he was listening in the courtyard when he heard Christ say, I can destroy this temple and rebuild it. And that twisted interpretation, taken out of context, was all that the authorities needed to justify condemning Christ, to remove any threat, to remove the specific threat that Christ was to the power brokers dwelling in the capital city of Jerusalem. From his youth, Christ stood out as different. The same is true, apparently, of Daniel. Let's continue reading in verse 10 of chapter 6 of the book of Daniel. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, that is to say, the executive order, when the writing was signed, he went home and he knelt down and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom. That passage in verse 10 reminds me of our Christ, who, when his hour had come, and he knew when his hour had come, he went into the garden to pray. There were no disciples to back him up. And just like that, Daniel was alone with his accusers nearby watching. And they spotted Daniel in prayer. And they ran and told the king to accuse Daniel of acting against the king. And they said that in verse 13. We can read that. They said Daniel was acting against the new rules. Daniel, who's one of the captives from Judah, that guy, he'd been there for 25 years, but he was one of the captives from Judah. Daniel does not show due regard for you, king, which is, again, similar to a passage in John, chapter 18, verse 22, when Christ, standing before the chief priests, was accused by one of the guards of being disrespectful to the high priest. And you recall that guard reached over and struck Christ, again, for being disrespectful. Let's continue in Daniel chapter 6, verse 14. And we're comparing Daniel and Christ and government. We're examining that. King Darius, in verse 14, when he heard these words against Daniel, was greatly displeased with himself, and he set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. Again, let's compare that with the reaction of Pontius Pilate, who, when he heard the accusations against Jesus, Pilate suspected that Jesus was innocent. But even a Roman governor can get bogged down in the swamp of the Persian deep state, the swamp of politics. Pilate thought Christ should go free. And you can read about that in Luke 23, verse 13. Pilate didn't really know Jesus. He didn't really care about Jesus. But Pilate recognized the accusers as players from the deep state of politics. Pilate instinctively knew that an innocent man was being railroaded by these people. Let's skip down to verse 16 of chapter 6. The key word in this chapter, in this verse, is deliverance. It's used again in Matthew chapter 27, verse 43. Deliverance, that's the key phrase. King Darius assured Daniel, here in verse 16, that his God would deliver him. In Matthew 27, verse 43, Christ heard the same words from people who said, let his God deliver him. Now, truthfully, they were saying it in a mocking way as he hung on the cross. But deliverance is what, from God, is the only thing that was going to save Daniel, the only thing that was going to save our Christ. Verse 17, another similarity. A stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the lion's den, and the king sealed it, as did his false accusers, sealing Daniel inside with these wild animals. This is verse 17. There's a similar parallel, a similar story with regard to Christ, when Joseph of Arimathea placed a stone over Christ's tomb, sealing it against wild animals. Daniel on the inside with them, Christ on the outside. Well, I should say that the animals were on the outside with Christ and on the inside with Daniel. But the similarities is very, there's a lot of similarities there. Later, accusers asked Christ accusers of Christ asked the Roman guards to set a watch over the tomb to keep the followers of Christ from removing the body and therefore perpetrating a fraud against the state. Verse 17 is a very telling passage in the relationship of these men and government. If you read that again, the king and the other branches of the government don't trust each other. Both parties independently put a seal over Daniel's stone over the lion's den. On the one hand, they didn't want Daniel to give him a pardon in the middle of the night. And on the other hand, Darius didn't want the bureaucrats to kill Daniel in the middle of the night and blame it on the lions. And that is a metaphor for the whole of government. The king appoints cabinet-level ministers and bureaucrats to help him run the government. And these usurpers maneuver to assume powers not given to them. But then that's no different than when our God appoints the angel Lucifer as ruler over the entirety of the earth, and that's not enough. He wants heaven also. Down to verse 18, please. Now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, turning away the musicians. His sleep went from him. Verse 19, the king arose very early the next morning and went in haste to the lion's den. Verse 20, and he came to the den, and he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel, convinced that he was dead. That reminds me of a parallel passage in Mark chapter 16, verse 2. The actions of the sorrowful women who came prepared to administer to the lifeless body of our Christ. And like King Darius, they were very surprised to see that Christ was alive. Drop down to verse 21 of chapter 6. Then Daniel said to the king, my God has sent his angels and shut the mouth of the lions. I was found innocent before him. That makes me recall the wave sheaf offering, where our Christ was presented before God and found to be innocent and an acceptable offering. This passage in Daniel chapter 6, verse 3, rereading that, it's obvious that the members of the ruling league, the other two governors and all the satraps, the ones scheduled to be replaced by Daniel, were against Governor Daniel because he was effective at making government beneficial to the king and to the people alike. Our Christ came to this earth the first time to announce a new government, but instead of being replaced, the existing office holders there in first century Jerusalem had our Christ killed. Notwithstanding their concerted effort, however, Christ's government will be established over all the kingdoms of the earth. Daniel's three buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they served with Daniel under King Darius and later under King Cyrus. What about you? What about me? If we were faithful like Daniel and his fellows, if we were good students and we practice godliness, and if we eschew falsehoods, and if we avoid slander, we do not cause innuendo, if we're ready to serve faithfully to the job to which we were appointed, we too can serve with Christ in his government, his new government to come.